This episode of Serverless Chats is sponsored by Dexecure. This week, Rebecca and I chat with Lee Gilmore about tactical serverless. This is Serverless Chats, episode number 139. Hi, everyone. I'm Jeremy Daly.
And I'm Rebecca Marshburn.
And this is Serverless Chats. Hey, Rebecca.
Hey, Jeremy. It's good to see you again. I feel like I just saw you yesterday.
I think it was just yesterday that you saw me. Yes.
Oh, wow. Well, that's great. And it feels quite nice, actually, to be less than 24 hours later. And here we are again. I don't know if we have anything to talk about that's new. Do you have anything to talk about, or should we just dive in?
Yeah, we might just need to dive in, and I think we should dive in because we have an extremely knowledgeable guest today that is writing a lot of content, sharing a lot of content. But what I really like about this guest's content is it's not just, okay, here's a tutorial on how you set up, here's how you set up streams on DynamoDB. Not that those tutorials aren't super helpful and are needed, but I think that this guest, the documentation and the blogs that he writes are very much so expanding the knowledge of where serverless fits into the larger architectural patterns that we're already using in organizations, and how you can bring that serverless thinking and that serverless mindset into those organizations and apply them to very, very common patterns. So I don't know if you'd like to introduce him.
I would love to, and I'm also really excited to talk about that content because this person is known for, I would say, multi-parters of content. Our guest today is Global Serverless Architect at Citi, Lee Gilmore. Hey, Lee, thank you for joining us.
Hey, it's great to be here. Yeah, thanks for the invite.
Yeah, will you tell the audience a bit about your role and what you do at Citi to kick us off?
Yeah, sounds good. So yeah, I'm Lee Gilmore. I'm a Global Serverless Architect at Citi. So that's based across EMEA and the US. And what I'm currently doing is working with the teams on a big serverless transformation at an enterprise level. So yeah, very busy at the moment, lots going on, but it's very enjoyable.
Yeah, so I think it's really interesting to start seeing titles too, like Global Serverless Architect. I think we just started getting titles like Cloud Architect and some of these other things. But there is a very different mindset when it comes to serverless applications. And I think building cloud applications, again, whether you're doing Kubernetes or doing any of these things, there's a lot of complexity that is there. And one of the things that we talk about a lot on this show, and I think we had Ant Stanley talk about this before as well, is like it is pretty easy to grab a template for the CDK or grab a Hello World, from Serverless Framework or from SAM or whatever, and get that very simple Hello World up and running. And then even beyond that, a little bit of research, a little bit of time watching some videos, maybe reading some of your blog posts and so forth, people can get to that next step and they can maybe even get to the MVP. Maybe they're even using Amplify or something like that to get to it. But what I always find is that you get this really nice proof of concept, things are running, and then all of a sudden it's like, boom, you hit a wall because there is just so much that goes into that next step, which is really getting it to that, enterprise ready or production level. So I'd love to get your thoughts a little bit on that. You write a lot about this, but what are your thoughts on that complexity of productizing a serverless app versus, getting that original MVP up and running?
Yeah, so this is where I'm quite big on what I call the serverless Dunning-Kruger effect. And I think it's, so easy for teams to spin up the salad stack. So, a React app or something in S3, an API layer with AppSync or API Gateway, Lambda, and something like DynamoDB. And within an hour, you could quickly get this put together, SLS deploy, it's in the cloud. And it's like, yes, serverless is so easy. It's not. I think it's very hard. I think, you're plugging together a lot of services. Each of those have their own complexities. They have their own config. So I think it's very easy to fall into the trap to think serverless is very, very easy. And that's where at a certain, an enterprise level, I typically look at kind of three main areas to focus on as we kind of transition from traditional architectures to, enterprise level serverless solutions. So they would typically be architectural layers. So how do we build in an enterprise serverless applications? Tech radar, so get some governance around the technologies that we use. get some kind of alignment and non-functional requirements. So an approach I call tactical DDR.
I would love when you first talked about what you were doing at City, you were talking also about, I almost want to take a step back. You're talking about how you're leading some of the transformation toward serverless. And can you tell us a little bit about the backstory, right? Like what was even it's not necessarily an easy decision to be like, okay, we're just going to go serverless. And so there's a lot of discussion, exploration, I'm sure debate that goes into what that means and what it will take to actually, it's not easy, like you said, to do that transformation and move in that direction. Can you tell us a bit about the pre-story, if you will, to get us to this place?
Yeah, sure. So, the original architecture that we've got has allowed the company to be very successful. But that kind of move from, a monolith with older technologies and an older database, that's not going to serve maybe in the future as we scale out and kind of scale up. So in that regard, I think, from the top down, it was very much serverless is the present and future of most production workloads. And it's going to give us the benefits, quick agility, moving quickly, allowing us to prototype very quickly and then productionize that and kind of push changes regularly in the production. So I think for all the right reasons, we're using serverless. But again, around that, the teams have took time to build out POCs and learn serverless, learn the complexities that you have. And, we're at a stage now where other parts of the business are now moving to this serverless approach. And I think this is where, you need to take people on that journey. There was a tweet by Elon Musk that said prototypes are easy, but production's hard. And I think that's very much the case, personally.
No, that's definitely true. So you mentioned this idea of like, you have these people that are going through the journey that basically the maturity of serverless or the maturity of the adoption of serverless really only happens within an organization by having people experience it, right? You can't just say, we're going to adopt serverless tomorrow and then know everything that you have to know, right? So you mentioned this serverless tactical approach, right? Or the serverless tactical DDR, and very much so complements this idea of the definition of ready and the definition of done that you write about. So I'm very curious about, I want to talk about this whole thing, right? And we can go wherever you want to go on this because it's just super interesting. And again, you have a whole blog post on this. I think you might have a series on this, but essentially the idea of, as an organization starts to adopt serverless, like what are the things that they can do initially? How does that progress? When do you say, okay, this is a prototype that we can test, whatever? When do you say this is a prototype we can actually put into production? At least, increase that maturity over time. Like what's that process look like and how do companies do that?
Yeah, so for our company and using a kind of tactical DDR approach, it's essentially looking at guardrails at the definition of ready stage. So as they pick up a ticket and, they're looking at a feature, what kind of criteria, what things do we need to think about at that early stage before we start the work? And then as the team kind of progresses through, it comes to the kind of definition of done. So what standards need to be in place before we actually push this to production? And, the things that make up tactical DDR are very much the things that I personally feel that teams don't think about. So that covers a multitude of things. So you've got things like threat modeling. A lot of teams don't think about threat modeling. I know people like Sheen Brussels has done a fantastic post on that, which really got me hooked into kind of threat modeling. And I think that just allows teams, at the very start, drawing out the architecture, just having a look at it and kind of finding any holes in it as a group, really fun, sticking the architecture diagram on a Miro board and quickly just adding on tickets for like traditional stride model, looking at spoofing and non-repudiation and those kind of things. And even that at that kind of early stage allows you to kind of plug some of the gaps before it actually even starts work, before the teams do any work whatsoever. But it also covers things like authorization. So again, very easy to push something into production, but have the team thought about how do we authenticate the APIs? Authorization, who should actually have access to that? I've seen in production people use API keys and usage plans as the only kind of way of tying down those API endpoints. There's things like compliance. So a lot of teams don't think about PII, so personal identifiable information. GDPR, it's a massive consideration when we're building out, and PCI DSS compliance. It covers things like testing. So do we have adequate testing? So end-to-end testing, unit testing, integration testing. It might be using synthetic canaries and, having things running in production, which is pretty cool. In the enterprise, internationalization. So, if we think about, especially for city, if we build a domain service, we want to be able to lift that and put it in a different locale. So have we thought about currencies and dates and, front-end internationalization, that kind of thing?
Nobody thinks about that, though.
They don't. Until somebody actually says, right, we need to drop this into a completely different country or
Right.
locale. And then it's a ton of rework. So why not think about this at the very start? And I think that's where having this at the definition of ready stage just means people think about this as they pick up a ticket. And there's things like caching. Would this help having any kind of caching with regards to cost or latency? Again, this is usually something that happens when teams are struggling with one of those things, cost or increased latency for the end users. And auditing. So again, this kind of feeds back into threat modeling a little bit, but can we tell who's doing what on the system? So, have you got CloudTrail enabled? Have you got versioning on buckets and, kind of access logging? Can we say who's actually accessing anything? If we've got customers that are busy interacting with the system, are we logging what they're actually doing for, again, non-repudiation? So if they turn around and say, no, I definitely didn't click on that button, you can see that they actually did because you're logging it, that kind of thing. It also covers load testing. So people think with serverless, well, you don't have to load test it. I think that's definitely not the case because,
Right.
Obviously your services might scale out very, very quickly, but downstream services might be affected by that. So how do you have buffering in there with maybe SQS and kind of batch and that kind of thing? Disaster recovery, most people don't think about this with production workloads, but, with DynamoDB, have you got point-in-time recovery, for example? What's your RPO and RTO? These are things that, again, with serverless, it's so quick to get things pushed out, but typically people don't think about it. It also covers documentation. So have we got Open API and Swagger docs? Are we using event bridge schemas? So we can document what an event looks like within a domain. And it also covers reporting. So as soon as you push something into production, management are going to be asking you, how is it performing? How do you allow teams to be data driven? So a very quick run through of tactical DDR, but that's the approach. So far, it's been useful for the teams I've worked with.
So that is a lot of truths and ideas to hold in your head at the same time, right? Anything from PII and GDPR to caching to load testing to
I can't even
performance
remember all the things
testing
you said.
I
There's
know,
so
I'm
many
trying to list
things.
it off. I almost started writing it down. I was like, no, I'll be able to list it. And then you kept going and I was like, oh my gosh, I should have started by writing this down. But so that's so many things to hold at once. I'm wondering if, I imagine that you have a, bullet, sub-bullets, checklist, like have we done all these things? If you have that, is it somewhere shareable that people can access that checklist? And if not, where are some of the resources that you learned how to put this together, right? And how can teams start to think about their own checklist of what they need to consider if they're making a tactical DDR?
Yeah, so I do have a GitHub repo which has an infographic which has the acronym and a little bit of a bullet point list against each of those to kind of think about. But most of the teams that I've worked with have took the items that have got definition of ready against them and added those to tickets. So, a standard template, it might be in Azure DevOps. So, wherever you're picking up those tickets. And the same with definition of done. And, this isn't going to be applicable to really small changes. It might be a text change on a front end. Well, obviously these won't be applicable, but I think just having them there for maybe a feature level, even at an epic level, when architects kind of start to have a look at this, it's worth just a quick glance through, and at least you've covered the main areas that most people forget about. Because I've done a couple of polls on LinkedIn, and these are the things that just generally don't get thought about in my experience.
Yeah, and I'm curious too. I mean, again, you listed a lot of things. There's a lot of, and I think Rebecca put it put it well when she said bullets and sub bullets, right? Because there's a lot of little things, and as that checklist grows, and there's more things that have to be done. And again, I get it. Not everything has to apply every time you launch some small thing, but I'm wondering how specialized team members need to be, how much they have to know about a lot of these individual things, right? So software development lifecycle and a lot of these, broader ideas around definition of ready and definition of done and so forth. Like these are things that I think teams eventually learn over time. But I'm curious about the specifics, right? And the specialization of, security in the cloud is tough. And I want to talk about serverless threat modeling in a minute, but security is tough even if you have all kinds of tools in place to do it. There's still things you have to think about. App security is just got to be top of mind. Even just configuring resiliency. We talk about, you talk about load balancing, or you talk about load testing, right? So load testing, that's one of those things where what happens when this Lambda function, the concurrency is met? Or what happens when events start dropping and they start sending to a queue? What happens when a queue backs up and it can't process because there's, everything starts flooding a dead letter queue or something like that? Like there's a lot to know in there beyond just, going through and checking off the checklist. So how specialized do people have to be? Do they have to be specialized? Do people need to be generalized in this stuff? Or as your teams grow, is that something that you really should think about, is saying like, we need people to specifically focus on these areas?
So that's a great question. So I'd say from my perspective, having sessions with the teams as an architect or an architect working across multiple products or domains, I think working through something like tactical DDR, that means, teams do start to understand that. And when you do serverless threat modeling, for example, and we're talking about, have you got versioning on that bucket, or is that API secured? I think just almost through osmosis, teams start to kind of take this in, and next time you do a threat modeling session, those things have already been thought about in the design, like the initial design. So, but again, I think teams fall into the trap thinking serverless is easy. And it definitely isn't. I mean, as you know. So yeah, I think it's just a lot of education. I do a lot of presentations at work and write a lot of blog articles, and then sit with the teams and go through the whys. For example, recently talking to the team about Lambda scaling up and talking to legacy databases and talking about connection management and, Lambda scaling up quickly, opening and closing connections, CPU going up on the DB and memory, and these are things that, again, teams don't typically think about.
Right.
So I don't know if I've answered your question there, because it may be very difficult to.
It might be unanswerable, if that's a word. Yeah. I think I think that's right. I mean, it's one of those things where it's over time. It's definitely education. That's the big piece of it. And piecemeal education is always tough too. So it's like, well, how do I do X? And then you go find a few blog posts, or you read some documentation on it, and then you learn that, and that's fine. But if that's not applied to the larger, or if it doesn't become part of that culture and part of the process, then I can see those things quickly falling through the cracks.
Yeah, and I would say at an enterprise level, this is where building out reference architectures.
Yeah.
So, teams shouldn't be, reinventing the wheel continuously, and that kind of falls into the architecture layers, having a kind of platform layer at the bottom. Things like differentiated heavy lifting. So, serverless teams shouldn't have to worry about VPCs or transit gateways and that kind of thing. All of that networking should be done from like a developer experience perspective, allowing teams to kind of use those reference architectures from a serverless perspective and, bake in that kind of good practice and that security at an early stage.
Hi, everyone. I just want to take a moment to thank our sponsor, Dexecure. Dexecure empowers web developers by automating tasks that are essential for every website, freeing up developer time to focus on building. Dexecure currently has 3 products to help your team. Their Web Asset Optimizer optimizes content like HTML, images, CSS, JavaScript, fonts, videos, and more. Their Third-Party Optimizer takes care of all your third-party assets, and their Intelligent Network Optimizer enhances the performance and resiliency of your website. Dexecure also has an open source product called OpenDexecure, a cloud-agnostic edge development framework. Now, what I love about OpenDex is that the developers can jump straight into product building and not worry about dealing with setup and all the other roadblocks that come from the complexity and configurations of other popular CDNs. If you're interested in trying Dexecure's products, you can for free. Just visit Dexecure's website at dexecure.com to sign up and learn more. That's DEXECURE.com.
Let's talk about threat modeling? Because we've said it a few different times, and it's almost like something that you want to be thinking about, so it's baked into all of the ways that teams are going to be developing something. But specifically, let's talk about how and why you should threat model. I want to say it's like almost self-explanatory, but let's talk about it. And really, I think where Jeremy and I want to end up around this idea is that in the new era of serverless, right, you can quickly chain services together. You can make super complex architectures. You end up having to probably try to simplify them a bit into reference architectures that other teams can use. And with the ability to build on serverless or to build quickly in any sense of the cloud, right? There's also the added downside of increasing the overall threat landscape. And you have the added layer that serverless is quote unquote relatively new. And so there are these threats that maybe have not yet been discovered, or maybe people are still getting educated around best practices compared to more traditional architectures where the threats are known per se, or, heavy air quotes on all known threats. And so let's talk a little bit more about this threat modeling. First, can you give us a quick, how and why, what goes wrong when you don't? And then some of this downside, right, of the threat landscape of serverless and how we should be thinking about it.
Yeah, so I think the biggest benefit of doing threat modeling is quite often what I see is teams missing certain things. We talked about, access logs, for example, on S3, or have you got CloudTrail enabled? And, if teams don't think about this, as soon as a security incident, that's when, you wish you had these things, or it could be an API that's only tied down with an API key and not using the Cognito, for example. Or what I typically do is just work with the teams on that initial architecture, just to, it should be fun. It should just be, 40 minutes, adding the Miro boards. We can all just add tickets on at the same time, little post-it notes. And nothing's too silly either. It could be things like internal actors. What happens if somebody offboards and leaves the company, but you haven't actually removed them from AD, say? Can they still access, internal services? Do they have access to things they shouldn't have access to, including data? So this is typically why I kind of work with the teams on looking at that.
I'm curious from your perspective, though. I mean, we talk a lot about the shared security model and, just the things that AWS does. There's a great, Ori Segal used to do this really, really well in all his presentations, where he would basically show, here's the shared security model for VMs and for containers. And then here's the shared security model for serverless. And there were so many more things that you didn't have to think about when you were building serverless, right? So things like even patching, like the Spectre and whatever, right? Like that was taken care of for you before you even heard about it. Your Lambda functions were already patched, right? And then, of course, there's this ongoing thing where each service that you use, DynamoDB, keeps getting better, right? It gets faster. It has more features. Things get added. Same thing with AppSync. More levers and switches show up in Lambda functions and the different event mappings and things like that. As that progresses and as that goes, clearly there is a huge benefit that is taken off of your shoulders when it comes to, or you get this huge weight taken off your shoulders with some of these risks. But some of these risks still exist. So just in terms of when you're doing threat modeling and when you're looking at this, what are the biggest ones? Like, what are the biggest things that you say, if I had to choose one thing that I could make sure was secure, or that I was really paying attention to with my serverless applications, what would that be?
Probably say just ensuring that, and this sounds silly, but I've seen this so many times in production workloads, but our API is actually tied down, because a lot of the time people just don't think about it. Or it could be that you're federated your authentication with AD. That's purely for the authentication, but nothing around authorization. So, it could be an internal application around finance, but somebody in the warehouse, because they've got an active login,
Yeah.
and because they're part of the company, because the authorization's not done, they have access. So it could be the cleaner, it could be the CTO, it could be anybody, just because you actually have the authentication side of it. So again, I've seen that quite a few times where the authorization aspect, taking that principal ID from the token and actually having some kind of lookup within the domain service, that's just not there. So definitely around authorization, I would say. And same goes with people offboarding. That's something that most teams, in my experience, forget about.
So beyond just serverless, locking down your APIs is just good practice at all. But like in terms of specific serverless things, I mean, you get functions that are infinitely scalable, let's say, right? So we always hear about denial of wallet attacks and things like that, though we've never seen that actually happen. At least to my knowledge, I've never seen it. But you also have things like, shadow APIs, right? Like just things like that where people keep publishing API gateways and publishing endpoints, and then they don't tear down the stack, right? So you might have hundreds of APIs out there that could access internal data, could be running old code. Oftentimes I see that those shadow APIs run old shared code that wasn't patched, right? Because again, you make a change to shared code. Most people aren't using layers and updating their layers, every time there's a deployment. So you get a lot of this old stuff in there. So I'm just curious. I mean, again, I'm only pushing you on this because I know you know more here, and we want to extract this from our guests. But I mean, serverless specific, right? Are there things specifically for serverless beyond best practices around security in general, but anything in serverless specifically that is something that you think people might need to look out for?
So one thing you mentioned there was the denial of wallet attacks. So a lot of teams don't think about adding reserve concurrency onto what could be just a health check endpoint, for example. Somebody hits that, they've got an active token, and they hit that 100,000 times a second, something silly like that. That's obviously going to use up all of your lambdas within your account, and that's then affecting production workloads. It's essentially throttling everything that you've got. So I don't see a lot of teams using reserve concurrency for that reason. But definitely, if I've got an internal application used by a handful of people, I would definitely have reserve concurrency onto those endpoints, regardless of it being internal or external, I guess.
So you're talking about, and I appreciate you, Jeremy, for having done this as well, where you're like, Lee, I know you know more. Like the word extract is a funny word to use, but thank you, Lee, for letting Jeremy extract that from you.
It's not an interview. This is an interrogation.
Yeah. In terms of, general security best practices, and then even more specific things you can do to and for when building with serverless. And then there's this other thing that you're passionate about, right, is architecture layers. And I think that these two things are going to be interrelated, right? If the way that we think about architecture layers is also needs to feed into or needs to play nicely with the way that we think about security and securing each of those layers. So will you dive into this a little bit? Because you actually explained it to Jeremy and I before we were recording quite well. And I don't want to take those words out of your mouth.
Okay, cool. Yeah, so this is something I'm quite passionate about. And this all kind of stems from, again, going back to the kind of serverless Dunning-Kruger effect. It's so easy just for teams within their kind of silos, and very much Conway's law, just developing within their own, like I say, silo. And what happens off the back of that is things like business logic is not reusable. It's not in the right place. People haven't thought about cross-cutting layers. So cross-cutting concerns, things like developer experience and kind of platforms. So it covers 5 main layers. The first one's the experience layer. So that could be Alexa apps. It could be mobile websites, anything like that. And these shouldn't really have any business logic within them. These should be, back-end for front-end APIs, very thin. The only logic that would be in there is kind of synonymous with what it is. So if it's an Alexa app, it might have code in there around doing that integration with Alexa. But that just means that, domain logic, which is in a domain layer, is then reusable. So I typically go, with my teams, we talk about order tracking. So if that order tracking business logic was in the Alexa app, then the mobile app can't use it, and the website can't use it. So having that domain logic within a well-encapsulated domain, and that's private, not accessible on kind of layer 7, you can't curl it or use Postman, well encapsulated, it's got a versioned API on there. It might be for asynchronous calls, it might be using EventBridge, so it's got, again, versioned event schemas. So that would be the platform layer within there. And then you've got the cross-cutting layer. So things like login, observability, things that you don't want every single team having to think about. And how do you do that at an enterprise level? So I'm quite big on that as well. And that covers things like authentication as well. How are you doing authentication between your back-end for front-end APIs and your domain APIs? So it could be a client credentials grant flow with OpenID Connect. Again, very secure, talking about security and kind of threat modeling. Then you've got the data layer. So for me, one thing I'm very big on is using EventBridge as that enterprise service bus. And that then allows obviously your domains to communicate asynchronously based on events. But that could also include things like data lakes, BI reporting, and things again that you want to think about at that kind of enterprise level. I guess what you don't want is one team using MSK, one team using RabbitMQ, and no standardized way of actually communicating across domains. And if you've got 40 teams, this is why you need that kind of governance, I feel like, around that. And then the kind of bottom layer, there's the platform layer. So that's like I said before, the differentiated heavy lifting. So we don't want every single team thinking about VPCs and transit gateways, that kind of thing. How can teams very quickly spin that up with a click of a button? It's a brand new domain or product. So I think that's very important, but also develop experience. So if we're talking about OpenID Connect and client credentials grant flow, how do you allow developers very quickly to say, I've got this resource server, I've got a client, I want to give it these particular scopes, because for me, again, that authorization should be in a shared AWS account, like a shared tools account almost. It should have an SLA around it and a team around it. And I guess these are the things that, thinking at that enterprise level, this is where you've kind of got the three things of tactical DDR, how are we building things, architecture layers, how we build them in the right way, then looking at the technologies that we use. So doing a tech radar, so created by a company called ThoughtWorks, which is very useful.
Yeah. So I mean, I love the breaking those layers down, and also thinking about where that ties into maybe domain-driven design for the different domains. We've had a lot of guests that have talked about this before too, and just this idea of like common language and so forth. Like an order tracking for one domain might actually mean something different for another domain, right? So order tracking in the warehouse might be different than order tracking on the website, or an order ID might mean something different or whatever. And having that language sort of encapsulated in that business logic is, or in that domain logic, is super important. I also, you make a really, really good point. If you have an Alexa app that is, allowing you to check your order status, and that has to do some sort of business logic in order to make that work that's specific to a domain, then you're just rewriting that across all of your different experience layers, right? And so you don't have that reuse there. The interesting thing you mentioned about the data layer, so that I think there's two ways to think of the data layer, and maybe I'd just love to hear your thoughts on this. So within your domain logic, within an individual microservice or individual domain, my assumption, I guess that my contention would always be that you want to have data specific to that domain in that specific microservice or within that bounded context. But I think what you mean by the data layer is sort of the way that data is shared and aggregated across these different services.
Exactly, yeah. And like you say, you want each of your domains to have, polyglot databases that, it should be the specific requirements of that domain. But I guess having that enterprise service bus in there, that allows you to listen to events and start building your own read stores. So again, keeping things loosely coupled, you could be, say, the order domain, and you're listening to stock events because you want to build up your own read store within the orders domain, so you don't have that tight coupling with the stock domain. Probably a bad example because you want that to be up to date, I guess, but that kind of premise where, that's what it's allowing you to do, and stitching all that data together as well for reporting or BI, which EventBridge is very good at.
So a pastime that people may or may not know about me by now is that I like to read our guests' recent tweets and then sometimes bring them up.
We call it stalking, but that's all right. Some people call it stalking.
People just call that Twitter now.
That's right.
I'm sorry that I use Twitter as Twitter and I read recent tweets of guests. Sorry, not sorry. But I really liked what you had tweeted recently, May 13th, 8:06 a.m. No, I'm kidding. I don't know, actually. It is May 13th, but I don't know what time it was. And you talked about your AWS wish list. And so I wanted to bring this up here because I would love for you to talk through what inspired it, and then talk us through what the wish is of this wish list in a little bit more detail, I guess. So you say, my hashtag AWS wish list dash For enterprise organizations, a service that allows you to share your versioned open API definitions for API Gateway and Event Bridge in one place tied down by OIDC, allowing internal domain platform teams to discover integration details as well as external customers.
Yeah, so what this was about basically is within that enterprise, again, going back to that order and stock domain example, making it easy for teams from a developer experience point of view to say, what does that up-to-date version schema look like without actually reaching out to that team? So I guess having a centralized service or place where you could go to, you could list out your domains or your products, however your business is kind of set out. And that would allow you just to view any events from the schema registry with Event Bridge that is synonymous with that domain or platform. And the same with the APIs as well, because again, for me, they should be very easy for teams to do. And I found in enterprise, obviously with a lot of different APIs and a lot of different teams, that becomes a lot of communication, a lot of emails back and forward, a lot of Slack messages. So I think just an easy way of encapsulating that in one place, I guess. But there are other services that I would definitely love to see as well.
Well, that's what I was going to ask you. Speaking of AWS wish list, so we actually asked Werner Vocals this. We said, "What's missing? Right? What is the next step for serverless? What's the next major event bridge or step functions or app sync? Is there something major that we're missing, or are we just at the point of incremental, expansion or improvement?"
Yeah, I think the biggest things that I think are missing personally would be serverless open search. I think that would be pretty cool, and serverless document DB. So I've wrote quite a few blog posts around connection management with DocDB and Lambda scaling out and different ways of doing that. But I think those two things would be the kind of cherry on the top of serverless services, personally.
I've been saying forever, like every reInvent, I'm like, all right, serverless Elasticsearch or serverless search or whatever, like that's going to happen this year, right? Like, yeah, that's tough. And you're right, the connection model still with Lambda functions. I know RDS proxy is a good solution when connecting to Aurora and RDS, but MongoDB and some of these other ones that do also require connection management there, depending on how you connect to them, those would be helpful to have a really nice solution to that as well.
I do love how wish lists often come out of, like, wish list is a nice term, but it usually comes out of some form of user pain, right? Where you're like, I wish I could. It's not like, wish list. It's like, man, I wish I could do this because I am slightly suffering right now.
My frustration list, maybe.
Yeah, my frustration list. So it's a good. As someone who enjoys language and marketing, it's a good marketing. Yeah, instead of calling it like my why list, it's like, oh, it's your wish list. Isn't that nice? So Lee, you create such a breadth and depth, a wealth of content, and you share this out through blogs, all sorts of ways. But your blogs are, I would say, they're like tomes. It's like it's a special experience to be led through the blog posts that you write. So let's talk a little bit about your like creation process, right? Like, how do you, in the same way where you had AWS wish list and you're like, I wish that there was, X, Y, or Z. How do you decide even what you want to write about? And then what's your process for writing and then sharing them out?
So the kind of inspiration side of, what I do the blog posts on is typically, I'll be working with a team and they're struggling with a particular area. So it could be caching, or, could be something around that kind of area. And if they're struggling with it, then probably other people are struggling. And again, we talked about the complexities of serverless. And what I typically do is create a repo alongside it, either serverless framework or CDK, but something tangible for somebody to very quickly deploy it, have a play around with it, reading the article at the same time and having a look at some code snippets. And, I like to do a lot of visuals in there because personally, I'm a very visual learner. So if something's really called out like that, I find it very easy to kind of take the concepts on board. So that's why I do it typically. So I've got a big list of articles that I still need to write. So there must be about 20 on there currently. But yeah, I think it's just how can you help people very, very quickly. And sometimes I'll have some kind of analogy or some kind of fake business with usually a fake logo and things like that. I did a what is serverless with like a taxi example. Again, kind of talking about shared responsibility and that kind of thing. But how do you make it easy for people to kind of pick this up and have a bit of a play around with and get that concept.
So you said that you have a running list. I think it's for, especially for someone who loves to write, that list will never get smaller, it'll only get longer. But curious, what's at the top of your list? What's like 1, 2, or 3 that you're like, I'm itching to write this?
So looking at the list at the moment, so I've got change data capture on there. So how do you do things like using the transactional outbox pattern and use change data capture to take data from one system to another? I've got storage first APIs, L3 constructs, location services, WebSocket subscriptions, AppSync auth, and there's just a huge list of things that, I've just never had the chance to write an article on, but hopefully they're going to be useful to people.
Well, one of the things you mentioned, that was a great list, and I'm sure people will really appreciate you writing those things. But one of the things that we always try to encourage people to, because you mentioned this, and it's part of the reason why you do this is because you notice a team having a problem with this or somebody struggling with this, and then you just figure somebody else is probably struggling with this too. And one of the things that we hear this all the time, especially I hear this from people who are like, I don't know if I should write this down because there's already a blog post kind of like this and whatever. And my advice to them is always like, just write it, like just put it out there. If you think you've figured out something or you've had an experience, sharing your experience can really help somebody else. Even if somebody else had a similar experience, your presentation of the experience may be different and it may click better with them. And I'm just curious what your advice would be to other writers that, again, as a prolific writer as you are, is there some advice you might give other writers in terms of how they can either come up with ideas or just get started with blogging and things like that?
Yeah, I think the first step is obviously it's scary kind of building in public and open yourself, and you're opening yourself up to criticism and that kind of thing. But I think it's just about helping the community. The serverless community is fantastic as a whole, which obviously and being a community builder, you see the breadth of articles that people write is just absolutely fantastic. But I think just go for it. Start small. Just write a small article on something you're doing, and just get it out there. Put it on LinkedIn or Twitter or something like that. But I think it's just taking that first step and then kind of building upon that over time.
Amazing. All right. Well, Lee, we are out of time, but this was amazing. And I think that I think there's a lot for listeners to get out of this. But if they want to learn even more and they want to read all these articles you do or be able to, creep you on Twitter and follow your AWS wish list.
Or get your really, really, really long checklist for, that thing is gold, the checklist for like figuring out bullet, sub-bullet. Yeah.
Right. So how do people find you?
Yeah, so if you do a search for Lee Gilmore and serverless on Google, there's quite a few articles there. So I'm on Medium, I'm on LinkedIn, so people can reach out. I love connecting with people and chatting all things serverless. And that's got links to GitHub and things like that.
Well, that's excellent. And just in case people want a really short, A to B shortcut, he's also on GitHub at Lee Gilmore Code, because I think that list is going to be total gold. So I'm going to go ahead and say that out loud here. We'll get that all in the show notes, so anyone listening can also click on those links. And Lee, thank you so much for joining us.
Awesome. Thanks for having us.
Thank you. And that's this week's Serverless Chat. Rebecca and I want to give a huge thank you to Lee Gilmore for being our guest this week, and to our sponsor, DexSecure. If you want to check out the show notes and a full transcript of this episode, you can find them at serverlesschats.com/139. For more Serverless Chat, subscribe, sign up to be an insider, check us out on YouTube, and follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. You can connect with Rebecca on Twitter at Becca Odelay and me at Jeremy_Daily. And if you want to keep up to date with everything serverless, make sure you subscribe to the Off by None newsletter at offbynone.io. Thank you so much for joining us, and we look forward to chatting with all of you again next week.